The perfect beginning. Ayesha had always dreamed of a fairy tale marriage. Growing up in a loving yet traditional family, she believed in the beauty of companionship and the promises of forever. Like many young women in her culture, she trusted her parents to choose the right partner for her. When they introduced her to Saad, a well-educated, soft-spoken man from a respectable family, she felt a mix of nervous excitement and cautious hope. Their first meeting was brief yet meaningful. Saad seemed kind, his words filled with warmth and maturity. He spoke about his ambitions, his family values, and his respect for marriage. Ayesha found herself drawn to his calm demeanor and the way he listened to her thoughts with genuine interest. Within a few weeks, the wedding was arranged. It was a grand celebration, filled with the laughter of family, the scent of fresh flowers, and the shimmer of golden lights. Ayesha, dressed in a stunning red bridal outfit, felt like a princess stepping into a new chapter of her life. As she walked into Saad's home after the wedding, she was welcomed with love and warmth. His family seemed affectionate, and Saad himself was gentle and considerate. The first few weeks of marriage felt like a dream: late-night conversations, morning tea shared with smiles, and the promise of a beautiful journey together. Ayesha believed she had found not just a husband, but a best friend. She decorated their home with care, cooked his favorite meals, and listened to his stories from work. She made efforts to adjust to her new family's traditions and routines, eager to be the perfect wife and daughter-in-law. Saad, too, was attentive in those early days, bringing her flowers and checking on her happiness. She felt blessed, convinced that she had stepped into a life filled with love and respect. Whenever she spoke to her parents, she reassured them that she was happy. "Saad is wonderful," she would say, feeling a genuine sense of gratitude. Her heart swelled with hope for their future, traveling together, building a home, perhaps even starting a family soon. But in the midst of all this happiness, Ayesha failed to notice the small cracks forming in the perfect picture she had painted. The little moments of silence when Saad seemed distant, the unspoken words between them when she tried to share her feelings, and the occasional dismissive tone in his voice, things she brushed aside as minor adjustments in marriage. She believed love was about patience, understanding, and compromise. And so, she ignored the uneasy feeling that occasionally crept into her heart. After all, wasn't every marriage about adapting to each other? Ayesha's story had begun with dreams and promises, but little did she know that the pages ahead would be filled with unexpected trials, ones that would test her strength, resilience, and understanding of love itself. The hidden truth. The first few weeks of Ayesha's marriage felt like a beautiful dream, but dreams have a way of fading when reality sets in. It started with little things: Saad coming home late without telling her, his sudden coldness, and the way he dismissed her efforts to make their house feel like home. At first, she told herself it was normal. Adjustments take time, she thought. But soon, the little things grew into something darker. One evening, as Ayesha set the dinner table with Saad's favorite dishes, she eagerly waited for him. But when he arrived, he barely glanced at the food. Instead, he sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, responding to messages with a faint smirk. "You didn't even ask how my day was," she said softly, sitting beside him. He sighed, not looking up. "I'm tired, Ayesha. Can I not have some peace when I come home?" His tone stung, but she quickly apologized. Maybe she was being too needy, she told herself. But as days turned into weeks, his neglect became more apparent. He rarely spoke to her unless necessary, barely acknowledged her presence, and never appreciated her efforts. Conversations became one-sided, with Ayesha trying to keep the spark alive while Saad remained distant. Then came the rules. "You don't need to visit your parents so often," he told her one day when she mentioned going over for tea. "They need to understand you're married now." Ayesha frowned. "But they're my family. I miss them." Saad's expression hardened. "I'm your family now. Focus on this home." His words left her feeling uneasy. But she wanted to be a good wife, so she agreed. Slowly, she started withdrawing from her loved ones, making excuses whenever her mother called. Each time, Saad's approval felt like a small victory, and his disapproval like a silent punishment. One night, while Saad was in the shower, his phone buzzed repeatedly. Ayesha glanced at the screen and saw a name she didn't recognize. A message popped up. "I miss you. When will we meet again?" Her heart pounded. She stared at the phone, her hands trembling. She wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but deep down, she knew this was the missing piece of the puzzle. His distance, his coldness, his control, it all made sense now. When Saad emerged from the shower, she confronted him. "Who is she?" she asked, holding up his phone. His face darkened. He snatched the phone from her hand. "You're invading my privacy," he said sharply. "Privacy? I'm your wife!" she cried. "You've been lying to me, haven't you?" Saad's expression shifted to indifference. "You're overreacting. Just stop making a scene." That night, Ayesha lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the painful truth sinking in. Her marriage was not built on love, but control, deception, and emotional neglect. The fairy tale had ended, and she was trapped in a reality she never imagined. A silent struggle. Ayesha stared at her reflection in the mirror, adjusting the dupatta over her shoulder. Her face looked the same, but the light in her eyes had dimmed. She had learned to smile, to laugh at the right moments, to say the words people expected from a happily married woman. But inside, she felt hollow. Ever since she discovered Saad's betrayal and his growing emotional neglect, she had lived in silent agony. She wanted to leave, to demand answers, to fight for her happiness. But every time she thought of speaking up, she heard the voices of society in her head. Marriage isn't always perfect. A good wife learns to adjust. What will people say if you leave? So she stayed. At family gatherings, she held Saad's hand when people were watching, even though he barely acknowledged her at home. When relatives asked how married life was treating her, she smiled and replied, "Alhamdulillah, everything is great." She became an expert in masking her pain, even when her heart ached every night as she lay next to a man who treated her like a stranger. Her parents, unaware of the storm inside her, looked at her with pride. "We're so happy you have a good husband," her mother often said. Ayesha wanted to scream, to tell them the truth, but she couldn't bear to break their hearts. They had given her away with so much love and trust. How could she tell them she was drowning? The loneliness grew unbearable. Saad rarely spoke to her, and when he did, it was either a command or a cold remark. The warmth from their early days had disappeared, replaced by silence, distance, and occasional disdain. One night, as she lay awake, she received a message from her childhood friend, Zoya. "I miss you, Ayesha. We never talk anymore. Is everything okay?" A lump formed in Ayesha's throat. For a moment, she considered telling Zoya everything, but instead she typed, "I'm fine, just busy with married life." She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Zoya or herself. As the days passed, the weight of her silence grew heavier. She had become a prisoner in her own life, trapped between her suffering and the fear of disappointing others. But how long could she keep pretending? How long could she keep smiling while breaking inside? Ayesha didn't have the answers. All she knew was that every morning she would wake up, put on her mask, and play her part in a story that was never truly hers. The unexpected betrayal. Ayesha had convinced herself that things would get better, that if she remained patient, if she loved Saad enough, if she fulfilled all the roles expected of her, he would change. But deep down, a lingering fear never left her. The distance between them had grown wider, the silences heavier. And then, one evening, her worst nightmare became a reality. Saad had left his laptop open on the dining table while he stepped into the shower. Ayesha had never been the type to invade someone's privacy, but something about the way he had been acting, constantly glued to his phone, leaving the house without explanation, coming home smelling of a perfume that wasn't hers, made her uneasy. A message notification popped up on the screen. "I can't wait to see you again tonight. Last night was amazing." Her heart stopped. With shaking hands, she clicked the chat. What she saw shattered the last pieces of hope she had been holding on to. Saad's messages with another woman, filled with laughter, longing, and intimacy, revealed a side of him she had never known. Words he never spoke to her, emotions he never shared, love he had never given. Ayesha's breath caught in her throat. Tears blurred her vision as she scrolled through their conversations. Photos, secret meetings, plans made while she sat at home waiting for him. Every lie he had ever told her, every cold glance, every moment of neglect. It all made sense now. He had never been distant because of stress or work. He had been distant because his heart was elsewhere. The bathroom door opened, and Saad stepped out, towel in hand. He froze when he saw the open laptop and Ayesha's tear-streaked face. For the first time, he looked guilty, but it lasted only a second before his expression hardened. "What the hell are you doing going through my messages?" he snapped. Ayesha stood up, her hands trembling. "Who is she, Saad?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the pain and betrayal she felt. He scoffed. "Does it even matter?" His indifference cut deeper than the betrayal itself. She had hoped for an apology, for regret, for even a hint of shame. But there was none. He wasn't sorry. He had never been sorry. Ayesha felt something inside her break. All these months, she had blamed herself, thinking she wasn't enough, that maybe if she tried harder, he would love her. But now she saw the truth. He had never valued her. She had been nothing more than a convenience, a role to be played in front of society. She wiped her tears, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. "I deserve better than this," she said, her voice steady despite the pain. Saad laughed bitterly. "You think anyone cares? No one leaves over something like this. Just accept it and move on." But he was wrong. Ayesha wasn't going to move on in silence. This time she wasn't going to pretend. The betrayal had shattered her, but in that moment she realized something. She would rather break than continue living a lie. Loneliness in a crowded home. Ayesha had always imagined marriage as a partnership, a journey where two people supported and uplifted each other. But in Saad's house, she felt like a stranger, an outsider merely existing in a space that was never truly hers. The house was always full, Saad's parents, his younger sister, visiting relatives. But despite the constant noise, Ayesha had never felt lonelier. The weight of her husband's betrayal, his emotional neglect, and the silent suffering she endured made every moment unbearable. Yet she remained quiet, keeping up the facade of a perfect wife and daughter-in-law. At family dinners, she sat among them, listening as they laughed and talked, but no one ever asked how she was. She served tea, cleared plates, and fulfilled her duties, but she was invisible. Saad's mother often praised him in front of others, speaking of how hardworking and responsible he was. Ayesha wanted to scream that it was all a lie, that the man they admired was not the man she lived with. One evening, after another tense silence with Saad in their room, Ayesha gathered the courage to speak to her mother-in-law. She found her sitting in the lounge, watching television. "Ami, can I talk to you?" she asked hesitantly. Her mother-in-law barely looked away from the screen. "What is it?" Ayesha swallowed her fear. I don't think Saad cares about me. He barely talks to me, and I think—" She hesitated before continuing. "I think he's seeing someone else." The older woman sighed, finally turning to face her. "Ayesha, men get busy, and even if he is, it's not something to make a fuss about. You're his wife, that's what matters." Ayesha's breath caught in her throat. "But Ami, he doesn't love me. I feel alone in this house." Her mother-in-law patted her hand dismissively. "Beta, a woman's strength is in her patience. Stop overthinking and focus on your home. If you create problems, people will blame you." Tears burned in Ayesha's eyes as she nodded. She had hoped for support, for someone to see her pain. But instead, she was told to endure it. Saad's sister, whom Ayesha had tried to befriend, wasn't any different. Whenever she tried to confide in her, she was met with indifference. "Bobby, every marriage has problems. Don't think too much, she would say before changing the topic. Ayesha realized that she was truly alone. In a house filled with people, no one saw her. No one cared about the silent battles she fought every day. She had become a shadow, present but unnoticed, surrounded yet isolated. Lying in bed that night, next to a husband who no longer looked at her, she asked herself a painful question. If no one in this house truly cared for her, then why was she still here? The breaking point for years, Ayesha had endured. She had swallowed her pain, buried her tears, and convinced herself that this was her fate. She had tolerated Saad's cold indifference, his betrayals, and his emotional neglect. She had learned to live in a house full of people who saw her but never truly noticed her. But every woman has a limit, and one night, Ayesha reached hers. It started like any other evening. Saad had come home late, reeking of perfume that wasn't hers, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his expression blank. Ayesha had stopped asking where he had been. She already knew the answer. But that night, something inside her felt different. There was no sadness, no desperation, just a quiet storm building within her. As she placed his dinner on the table, she gathered the courage to say what had been buried inside her for so long. Saad, I can't live like this anymore. He barely looked up, scrolling through his phone. Then don't. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to continue. I want a divorce. That got his attention. He looked at her, eyebrows raised, a smirk tugging at his lips. Really? And where will you go? Back to your parents? You think they'll welcome a divorced daughter? Aisha's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists. I don't care. I'd rather be alone than live like this. Saad chuckled, shaking his head. You're being dramatic. Women like you don't leave. You'll cry for a few days, then adjust, just like always. Something inside Aisha snapped. The years of loneliness, humiliation, and silent suffering crashed over her like a tidal wave. She thought of all the times she had waited for him, all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, all the moments she had begged for even a shred of love. And suddenly she realized he was right. She had adjusted for far too long, and she was done. That night, as Saad slept soundly beside her, unbothered by her pain, Aisha quietly packed a bag. She didn't take much, just a few clothes, important documents, and the last fragments of her self-respect. She looked around the room one final time, not with sadness, but with relief. For the first time in years, she wasn't scared. She wasn't thinking about what society would say, what her family would feel, or what Saad would do. She was thinking about herself. As she stepped out of the house, into the cold night air, she felt something unfamiliar yet powerful, the weight of her suffering lifting. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: she would never look back. The courage to walk away. Aisha had always been taught that a woman's strength lay in her patience, that no matter how much she suffered, she was supposed to endure, to adjust, to compromise, to stay. But as she stepped out of Saad's house with her small bag in hand, she realized that real strength was in walking away. The night air was cold, but for the first time in years she felt light. Her heart pounded as she stood outside the gate, staring at the empty street ahead. She had no clear plan, no guarantees of what lay beyond, but she knew one thing: she could not stay in that house any longer. A taxi pulled up, and as she gave the driver her parents' address, doubts crept in. Would they understand? Would they take her back, or would they tell her to return to Saad, to adjust, like always? But Aisha pushed the fear aside. Whatever happened, she would face it, because anything was better than the life she was leaving behind. When she arrived at her parents' home, she stood outside the familiar door, hesitating. She hadn't told them she was coming. She had spent years pretending everything was fine, afraid of burdening them with the truth. But tonight, there were no more lies. She knocked, her hands trembling. Her mother opened the door, surprised to see her so late. Aisha, what are you doing here? One look at her daughter's tear-streaked face, the bag in her hand, and the brokenness in her eyes, and she understood. Without a word, She pulled Ayesha into a tight embrace. Ayesha broke down, sobbing into her mother's shoulder, the weight of years of suffering finally releasing. That night, she told them everything: the neglect, the betrayal, the loneliness, the heartbreak. Her father sat in silence, his hands clenched in fists, while her mother wept softly. Ayesha braced herself for their disappointment, for the inevitable words, "You should have tried harder." But instead, her father said, "You're home now. That's all that matters." Ayesha couldn't hold back her tears. She had spent so long fearing their rejection, only to realize that love had never abandoned her. It had just been waiting for her to come back. The next morning, she woke up to sunlight streaming through her childhood window. She had no idea what her future looked like. Society would talk. People would judge. Saad might try to humiliate her, but none of it mattered anymore. For the first time in years, Ayesha was free, and with that freedom came something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Facing the world alone. Ayesha had thought leaving Saad would be the hardest part, but she quickly realized that society had its own way of punishing women who dared to walk away. The whispers began almost immediately. Relatives who once praised her wedding now lowered their voices when she entered the room. Family friends avoided eye contact. Even some of her closest friends hesitated to reach out, unsure of what to say. She must not have been a good wife. A woman should compromise. Marriage isn't easy. Who will marry her now? The words stung, but Ayesha refused to let them break her. She had suffered too much to turn back now. She knew she couldn't depend on her parents forever. She needed to stand on her own feet. Finding a job wasn't easy. Most employers preferred married women or those with a stable background. At every interview, she felt the judgment in their eyes when she mentioned she was divorced. But she kept pushing forward. She took whatever work she could find, from tutoring children to freelancing online. Slowly, she started rebuilding her life. One day, she ran into an old college friend at a cafe. "I heard about what happened," the friend said, her voice laced with pity. "It must be so hard for you." Ayesha smiled, but there was strength in her eyes. "It is," she admitted, "but staying in a loveless marriage was harder." That was the moment she realized. She wasn't ashamed of her past. She wasn't broken. She was a survivor. As months passed, Ayesha learned to enjoy her own company. She found comfort in books, in morning walks, in small victories, like the first paycheck she earned, or the first time she slept peacefully without fear. The world still judged her, but she no longer cared. She had walked away from a life that was destroying her, and in doing so, she had found herself. And that was worth more than anyone's approval. A new beginning, Ayesha's journey was far from easy, but each step she took toward independence felt like a victory. With the support of her parents, she carved out a new life for herself. Slowly, she built a career, starting with small freelance gigs that grew into something more. She enrolled in professional courses to expand her skills and put herself in spaces where her abilities were valued. It was exhausting at times, but it was hers. Her work, her achievements, her future. She started working as a project manager for a small startup. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave her purpose and confidence. Every time she got a project right, every time her team succeeded, she felt the weight of her past loosen, like chains breaking off one by one. Slowly but surely, Ayesha was rediscovering the woman she had once been, before the weight of a broken marriage had crushed her spirit. But as much as she focused on her career, Ayesha knew she had to heal emotionally too. The scars of her past lingered, and though she had let go of the anger, she still carried the fear of betrayal. Trusting others and trusting herself was the hardest part. It wasn't until she met Imran that Ayesha began to see that trust didn't have to be something to fear. Imran was kind, patient, and had been through his own struggles. He didn't rush her, didn't push for more than she could give. Instead, he let her take her time, respecting her boundaries, while showing her that love could be a safe space, not a battlefield. One evening, after a year of knowing each other, they sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. Imran turned to Ayesha, his eyes filled with tenderness. "You know, I'm really proud of you," he said softly, "not because you've done everything alone, but because you've kept going, even when life tried to break you." Ayesha smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I didn't know how strong I was until I had no choice but to be." She looked out at the city, the night air cool on her face, and for the first time in years, Ayesha felt truly at peace. She had come so far, her own strength, her journey, her healing. It was all hers. And though she still wasn't sure where life would take her next, she knew this. She could handle it. Love, she realized, wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. It wasn't about perfection. It was about trust, respect, and taking the time to build something meaningful. And for the first time in a long while, Ayesha felt ready. She wasn't afraid to love again, not because she was certain everything would be perfect, but because she knew she had the strength to face whatever came her way. Ayesha had learned to love herself first, and in doing so, she had made room for a new love, a love that was built on the foundation of mutual respect, trust, and healing. She was no longer defined by her past. She was defined by her courage, her resilience, and her belief in a future that was hers to create. This was just the beginning. The message of hope. Ayesha's journey, though deeply personal, became something much larger than she ever expected. As she rebuilt her life, finding strength, rediscovering joy, and eventually learning to trust and love again, she began to notice something incredible. Women who had been through their own struggles started reaching out to her. It began with a simple message from a former college classmate. "Ayesha, I heard what you went through. I'm going through something similar, and I don't know how to keep going. How did you do it?" At first, Ayesha was taken aback. She hadn't realized that people were watching, that her story had impacted others. She had simply been focused on her own healing. But over time, the messages kept coming. Women, many of them from her own community, reaching out with stories of their own heartbreak, struggles, and desires to break free. One day, she found herself speaking at a small women's support group. The room was filled with women of all ages, each carrying their own burdens. Ayesha spoke about the years she had spent silently suffering, the choices she made to leave her marriage, and how it felt to begin again from nothing. She spoke honestly about her pain, but also about her growth, how she had come to realize that leaving wasn't a sign of failure, but of strength. "I know that sometimes it feels like the weight of the world is on your shoulders," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I promise you, there is light beyond the pain. There is life after the heartache. You don't have to stay in a place that doesn't serve you, even if society tells you that you should. You are worthy of love, respect, and happiness. And most importantly, you are strong enough to find it on your own." The room fell silent, but there was a shift, a quiet understanding that they were not alone. After the meeting, several women approached her, sharing their own stories and thanking her for giving them the courage to take the first step. It was then that